I now have seen with a gleaming gleam 2 sides of the tale without a fail, one of good, one of bad, adversity to make me mad. The good one told me the good key, what was done for all his fun, and of the fame and of the shame, and how it had, even though sad, destroyed his past life. The bad one told me to see what intoxications and sensations would do for me, for it would open up your minds who see. One push, one pull, for the trail to stroll, one let go, and then so his good path I followed. Welcome to this outdoor philosophy. We're going to continue talking about building a bridge to the 18th century, and I chose to open with an excerpt of a poem that I wrote a good 20 or so years ago, because we're talking about language and postmodernism, and what Postman is going to do in this section is look at the evolution of language and one of the filters of this thing that we call postmodernism. And postmodernism itself is a general philosophy that overall it just sort of means either there is no truth, or if there is a truth, we can't know it. And that is kind of the summarized definition of now. But because we are in this postmodern period as it is right this moment in time, it's hard to nail down an exact definition. As he says, it would be hard for the writers at the time of the Enlightenment to put a definition on the term enlightenment. And so Postman's going to address the aspects of postmodernism as it deals with language in this chapter. And as we are talking about language and looking at the language, some of the things that we see, just some interesting stuff. Now, there's some older backstory stuff that I'm not quite as knowledgeable about on all the philosophers. I've read a little bit of them, but not nearly as much. But what I want to kind of get into is some of the things that kind of led to some of our modern thought, and then leading us into the very place we are right now. Because once again, in this chapter, Postman demonstrates himself very prophetic tone as he's examining a lot of the things. Of course, one of the early skeptics, and oftentimes postmodernism comes with skeptics and with doubt, with Thomas Paine, as he is openly rejecting Christianity in a nation that's mostly Christian for a pretty good cause and effect. And so he writes down in his manuscript, The Age of Reason, which was not a very well-received publication. Now, of course, he received his fame from a book in 1776 called Common Sense, written by an Englishman, which was essentially, of that time, probably a bestseller, as many as at least a quarter of the population or more had read it. Based upon all estimations. But then he comes up with his Age of Reason, and where a lot of people decided to just kind of abandon where his direction is and where he was going. And the reason is because he was doing so much heavy skepticism. He was doubting a lot of the foundations a lot of people held very dear, whether you held that or not yourself. So as we look at all these different philosophers, all these people that we know about, and he gives us a list of these. Jefferson, and I've read some of Jefferson's stuff, Lesevere, Burke, Paine, all these guys. These were not professional writers. And this is one of these things in our modern era, is that if we are writers, and I write books, and I can't sit here and say I make a living off my books. It's more of a joy. Occasionally I get enough money to, maybe buy a cheeseburger here and there, depending, if this channel were to blow up and I have a ton more books that were more geared towards this audience and not towards a much smaller audience, I'd probably sell more. But ultimately what the goal is to say that these people weren't professional writers of their times. They held their occupations in other things. And that's kind of where our world is built off of amateurs. So, of course, Paine wrote in The Age of Reason why he doubts the Christian view, for he writes, "For neither Joseph nor Mary wrote any such matters themselves, only reported by others that they said so. It is hearsay upon hearsay, and I did not choose to rest my belief upon such evidence." And for that statement, he was really ostracized because there was a lot of people that did believe faith. Now, Whether you want to ostracize somebody or not based upon their faith or lack thereof, that's a different story and a different place for a different channel for me. I do believe that, and there's ample evidence why I do, but again, I'm not going to get into that all here. All right. Of course, the Postman writes in here that Jefferson probably agreed with Paine. Jefferson was one of the founding fathers that was not a specific Christian. He was a deist in that he believed there was probably some type of God, but he actually rejected the Christian God as that God. So, of course, Postman writes here that Paine, or Jefferson probably believed exactly as Paine did on these matters, but after all, there are limits to reason and clarity. And that's a fabulous little sentence and a way to say, be wise in things. You may disagree with something, but it's not always in your best interest or in society's best interest to voice that, because we all have different views and thoughts and opinions on things. But these begin this deconstruction, and deconstructionism is one of the major tenets that we find in the postmodern view, is to deconstruct everything. And there are certainly some areas of life where that is a fine approach. The problem is that the postmodernism itself moves so far. And again, he's discussing it primarily for language, but it moves so far in this direction, so far, that it begins to erode it, even what truth is. And that is so much where we get to. So, like I said, there's going to be some very prophetic things in this chapter here. I encourage you to give it a read to see some of the history here. So Einstein, even writing in his theory of relativity, or meaning of relativity, and that's one I've read. He even writes in there and understood that language is a social convention with both its structure and content were not necessarily useful in understanding the nature of reality. In other words, he's saying like language evolves, particularly living languages. So this is where there's importance of studying some things like Koine Greek, which is the Greek written in the original Bible, which is technically a dead language. There's modern Greek, which utilizes a lot of the same alphabet and the same words and things, but there is a distinct difference. Latin, of course, is the most known dead language, and by dead it just means it's not actively being used. And the advantage of a language not being actively used is its definition never shifts. So Latin, since the time it stopped being used as a regular language, the definitions, the meanings, and the words have not shifted. So it gives us essentially a time capsule through language by which we can look at how things move. And this is why I just did a video on my Christian channel about I was talking about Bible translations, and I outlined why the King James Version is not a particularly good Bible translation. And the reason for that is because languages evolve. The English language is the most used language in this world, and it is constantly evolving. We cannot take an English language from 400 years ago, because the King James was originally the 1611 edition. It was written 400 years ago. It doesn't mean the same things now as it did when it was written, because the language evolves. And that's what Einstein was getting at, is that language does evolve. And so as we study these ancient authors, we also have to do a study of the language and the meaning at its time. And this is important to raise, because as we get into what we know now as postmodernism, we start to see a deconstructionism, because people are saying that everything we know about language is wrong, and that's not true either. And he summarizes it perfectly in here. So let me just read some excerpts here. This is on page 78, if you got a copy of the book that I have here. Postmodernism is simply skepticism elevated to the highest degree. We may give it muted applause, and the applause must be muted because even skepticism requires nuance and balance. To say that all reality is a social construction is interesting, indeed provocative, but requires nonetheless that distinctions be made between what is unprovable opinion and testifiable fact. And that is the core thing, because there is a word in there, you may have heard it, and it's being so readily used today: social construct. How many things in our modern day liberalism, maybe social justicism, are they coming out and saying social construct? It's a social construct that XYZ. Implication, we need to kill, crucify maybe the social construct on public display so that we can get away with all of that old barbarianism and move on to what is true, but there is nothing true. That's the problem with postmodernism. And the thing is that when you look at opinionated things and you look at what things are doing and what things are saying and how everything works like this, when you start examining that, okay, there is a difference between an opinion, like I don't like tomatoes, you might like tomatoes, you might not like tomatoes. But we can't say, fact, tomatoes are good, or fact, tomatoes are bad. We can say, fact, tomatoes have some phytonutrients in them that are healthy. We can say that, but we can't say tomatoes are good or tomatoes are bad, because that is a subjective opinion. And that's where we get the concept of subjectivism and objectivism. And so a subjective view is an opinion. We can't say an opinion is right or wrong. It just is. Now, people's opinions may change, that's for sure. But there's a difference between that and a testifiable fact. And it is for this that Google engineer, what was his name? I forget. Google engineer. He simply writes an internal memo going, I mean, these are some outlined facts. And I read the whole thing, okay? He was making very good points from objective, biological, real, true, and non-questioned science. Dinsmore was at it. He's let go, because he chose to talk about objective truths in a subjective world. And that's the danger. He writes, one may also say something about, oh wait, hold on. There's one more thing. And this is his example. I wanted to talk about his example of what he was talking about. I just used the one from the Google engineer. I want to look at the examples here. One can use 1,000 words in French or any other language to show that a belief is a product of habits of language. And graduate students by the carload can join in by the fun. But blood still circulates through the body, and the AIDS virus still makes people sick, and the moon is not made of green cheese. Okay, so when we are questioning the world, we have to know the difference between what is fact and what is opinion. Now, one of the major problems we have now is that what is fact and what science seems to demonstrate is not always the same. Trust me, I was a scientist. Science is more about politics than it is about anything else. And you can look at any individual industry. I'm most knowledgeable about the nutrition industry, which is where I spent a lot of my studies looking at. A lot of what the doctors and the scientists are telling us about health and nutrition right now is politically motivated or financially motivated, not based upon what the truth is. Because it is not a fact that consuming fat increases cholesterol and causes heart disease. In fact, consuming healthy natural fats like you would find in a cow or in a pig actually reduces cholesterol. Well, what it does is it shifts the cholesterol balance. It shifts the HDL and LDL profile, favoring HDL, lowering LDL, and it lowers triglycerides, which is a better marker of how healthy you are. But your doctors and science keeps on coming out saying, reduce your fat diet, reduce your fat diet. There's no science behind it. Zero. Nothing. But there's a lot of political motivation to push this low-fat diet. I'm going to leave that for discussion for another day. That's the problem, is that even what we know as facts may or may not be facts. But in even the most common facts in our society, we are casting aside. Like, what can be more factual than there are males and there are females? And yes, I understand there's a very small genetic chance of having an abnormality, which is known as an abnormality, but you either got part A or you got part B. That's not up for subjective debate, people. It's not. If you feel something different in your head, that's a different matter, either for medicine or for anything else. But what your head says and what reality produces is not necessarily in conflict. And that's kind of part of the challenge. So as we examine our language, now of course, why did I start out with that poem? What was the purpose? The purpose is, Postman continues to write here, one may also say something like this about the postmodern view of the text. Roland Barthes is frequently cited as the originator of the announcement that the death of the author. He is taken to mean that readers create their own meanings out of text irrespective of the author's intentions. And this is kind of where I'm going to pause for a moment. And this is why I opened with that poem. Okay, that poem has one very specific meaning. Now, for sure, somebody could read it and go, well, I could apply this concept to something I'm going through. Obviously, the poem is about conflict. Now, in the truest sense, the poem is about specific conflict between two specific people that I can actually attach names to. So, for sure, nobody else is going to read that poem and know 100% everything I mean. And for sure, anybody could read the poem, recognize that it's about conflict. It's about two different people trying to influence a person with two different worldviews, and the person has to make a decision between it. That's all fundamentally what the poem means that I started with. You could say, well, he's talking about this or that. You could say he's talking about, the battle between Microsoft and Apple. I wasn't. Maybe someone could apply it to that, and that would still fit the concept of two different people, or you could say groups of that. And so this is where there is a degree of this that is okay. But to read the poem and say, he's talking about, can't even come up with an example because I know the poem so intimately, but if you try and attach any other meaning to that poem outside of a person sitting in the middle of two different warring views trying to pull him in their own different respective directions, any meaning you have for that poem outside of that, I'm sorry, as the author, you are wrong. Because there is some objectivity even in the midst of subjectivity. Now, you could read the poem and you could say, wow, I feel this because I remember this conflict I had between two friends, and they were both trying to get me to believe in two different things. That would be a good application of my poem applied to your life circumstances, and that is why arts are so important. It's why they're so important. All right? And that's why this this chapter on language and postmodernism is fascinating, because the reality is, if we are examining our world around us, we have to consider that there is a time, a place, a language, and a meaning and a purpose between what's out there. And this is where there is a form of Bible study called methodical Bible study, where you ask those very questions. You need to understand something of the culture. You need to ask who is being spoken to, who is doing the speaking, what is the person saying, and what does it mean in that context, in that culture. When you understand that, then you can back apply it to the rest of your life. So Postman ends and concludes the chapter by saying, perhaps some of our philosophers have been driven to a Caliban-like despair. You taught me language, and my profit on't is that I know how to kill and be cruel. So if it is understandable but not acceptable, can we go into the future believing that gibberish is as good as any other form of language? See, the take-home message here is that language has to have a meaning. It has to have a purpose. Otherwise, we're just grunting like apes. And we're not grunting like apes. We have a powerful and amazing society, and we have to recognize that there is actual fact in this world. And sure, there is certainly some opinion. We have to learn how to parse those things out and make our own decisions. Postmodernism is indeed very dangerous because it raises too many questions and concerns about what do we actually mean and what is right, what is true. And the battle against social constructs is a scary battle because it's waging quite a bit in our world. And we need to not bow our tails and conform to what a few people want us to do. We need to hold strong and have, swallow hard, a collaborative society where, despite our differences of opinions, we are still free to share those opinions. Despite the challenges around us, we can't just say because somebody says, a black guy or whatever doesn't mean he's racist. I don't even know if that's a politically correct term or not anymore. I don't care. I don't care. Now, I'm not going to be running through the streets screaming the N-word, that's for sure. That would probably be a little bit more disrespectful. But at the same token, just because somebody is offended by something I say or do doesn't mean I need to change my behavior. Maybe we just need to learn to toughen up a little bit and realize that the world is an offensive place. Just a thought. And I think that this move and this drive into modern postmodernism, that's a contradiction of terms, has done more damage to our society than any good. And we need to set that aside and return back to what we know is right and treat fellow man as we'd like to be treated. My part, that's sexist. Oh, well. Wow, this is a doozy. I can feel that demonetization coming on this video. So if you want to help support the channel, check out the Patreon page, patreon.com/TomM. You can pick up a t-shirt or a coffee cup or mouse pad or a number of other things over at shop.switchtolinux.com. And you can find out other ways to help support the channel on the website at switchtolinux.com/support. There's some Amazon affiliate links in the description down below. If you ever shop on Amazon, that's a great way to help support the channel. So thank you for watching, and hope that you enjoy switching to Linux.